Imagine this. It's 1498, and you're standing on a beach in Lisbon, watching a massive wooden ship weighing over 200 tons, being pushed from solid ground into the ocean for the very first time. No cranes, no modern machinery, just ropes, wooden rollers, hundreds of men, prayers to the saints, and one question burning in everyone's mind. Will she float, or will she sink? The Portuguese didn't just build ships that changed the world. They had to figure out how to get these massive vessels from the shipyard into the water without destroying them. And what they created was nothing short of ingenious. Today I'm taking you back 5 centuries to reveal the incredible engineering, the dangerous moments, and the forgotten techniques that launched an empire. Before we dive into this amazing journey through maritime history, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss the incredible stories and historical deep dives coming your way on this channel. Now let's get into it. Let me take you to where it all began, the shipyards of Portugal during the Age of Discovery. These weren't just construction sites. They were the beating heart of an empire that would soon span 3 continents. When I think about the Portuguese shipyards of the 15th and 16th centuries, I'm absolutely amazed by their scale and sophistication. The most famous shipyard was the Ribeira das Naus in Lisbon, located right along the Tagus River. This wasn't just one building, it was an entire complex that stretched along the waterfront, employing thousands of workers at its peak. From this single location, the ships that would discover new routes to India, Brazil, and beyond were born. Can you imagine the noise, the smell of fresh-cut timber, the sound of hammers against wood echoing from dawn until dusk? But Lisbon wasn't alone. Porto had its own significant shipbuilding operations, particularly along the Douro River. These northern shipyards often specialized in smaller vessels, fishing boats, and coastal traders, but they were no less important to Portugal's maritime dominance. Then there were shipyards in the Algarve, in cities like Lagos and Tavira, where the proximity to both the Atlantic and Mediterranean made them strategic locations for building and launching vessels. What fascinates me most about these shipyards is how they were organized. They weren't random collections of craftsmen, they were highly structured industrial operations centuries before the Industrial Revolution. The Portuguese crown directly controlled the major shipyards, appointing a provedor dos armazéns, or overseer of the warehouses, who managed everything from timber procurement to worker schedules. The location of these shipyards was carefully chosen. They needed access to deep water for launching, protection from storms, proximity to timber sources, and flat beaches or gently sloping shores that would make the launching process possible. The Ribeira das Naus had all of these advantages, plus one more. It was right next to the royal palace, allowing the king himself to oversee the construction of his fleet. Storage was another critical consideration. These shipyards had enormous warehouses where timber had to be aged and dried for years before it could be used. Oak for the hull frames, pine for the planking, cork for various applications, all of this had to be stored, protected from rot and insects, and carefully inventoried. The Portuguese developed sophisticated methods for preserving wood, including submerging certain timbers in seawater for extended periods. The workforce at these shipyards was incredibly diverse. You had master shipwrights who had learned their craft through decades of apprenticeship, carpenters who specialized in different parts of the vessel, caulkers who sealed the seams with oakum and pitch, sailmakers, rope makers, blacksmiths forging thousands of nails and iron fittings, and laborers who did the heavy lifting and moving of materials. What really strikes me is how these shipyards became centers of innovation. When the Portuguese needed to develop the caravel, that revolutionary ship design that could sail against the wind, it was in these shipyards that the experimentation happened. Shipwrights would modify designs, test new configurations of sails and rigging, adjust the hull shapes to improve speed and maneuverability. This was practical engineering at its finest, where theory met practice on the drawing board and in the construction berths. The economic impact of these shipyards on Portuguese society cannot be overstated. They created employment for thousands, stimulated related industries like ironworking and rope-making, and attracted skilled workers from across Europe. Italian, Flemish, and English shipwrights came to Portugal to learn and contribute to these advanced construction techniques. Now let me walk you through the incredible process of actually building one of these ships. When I researched this topic, I was blown away by the complexity and craftsmanship involved. Building a Portuguese carrack or galleon wasn't just construction. It was an art form that took years to complete. Everything started with the keel, the backbone of the ship. The keel had to be made from a single piece of timber or carefully joined sections that could withstand enormous stress. Finding a tree large enough and straight enough for a ship's keel was a challenge in itself. Once selected, this massive timber would be shaped and positioned on the slipway, which was the sloped ramp where the ship would be built and eventually launched. The slipway itself deserves attention. It had to be constructed at precisely the right angle, steep enough that the ship would slide into the water when the time came, but not so steep that the ship would rush uncontrollably into the sea. Portuguese shipwrights typically used angles between 110 and 115, meaning for every 10 to 15 feet of horizontal distance, the slipway dropped 1 foot in elevation. Once the keel was in place, the shipwrights would begin erecting the frames, the ribs of the ship that gave it its distinctive shape. These frames were usually made from naturally curved oak timbers that had been carefully selected for their shape. The Portuguese had teams of workers who would search forests specifically for trees with the right natural curves, because using naturally curved wood was much stronger than trying to bend straight timber. Each frame was carefully shaped and positioned according to the ship's design. The master shipwright would work from experience and from scaled models, because detailed blueprints as we know them today didn't exist. These craftsmen carried the ship's lines in their heads, passed down through generations of oral tradition and hands-on teaching. It's absolutely remarkable when you think about it. They were building vessels capable of crossing oceans without computers, without calculators, without even standardized measurements. After the frames were erected and secured to the keel, the planking process would begin. This was painstakingly slow work. Each plank had to be carefully shaped to fit the curves of the hull, fastened with wooden pegs called tree nails and iron nails, and fitted so tightly that minimal caulking would be needed. The planks overlapped in a technique called clinker building for smaller vessels, or were placed edge to edge in carvel construction for larger ships, which the Portuguese perfected. The Portuguese were masters of carvel construction, which created a smooth hull surface that was faster through the water and more suitable for mounting cannons. Each plank was carefully fitted, and the seams between them were caulked with oakum, old rope fibers unraveled and mixed with tar, then sealed with pitch. This caulking process was absolutely critical. A poorly caulked ship would leak and potentially sink. As the hull took shape, attention turned to the internal structure. Decks had to be built, reinforced with beams strong enough to support cannons, cargo, and crew. The Portuguese ships of exploration typically had multiple decks: a main deck, an upper deck or quarterdeck at the stern, and a lower deck or hold for cargo. Each deck required careful planning and construction. The stern and bow sections required special attention. The stern castle, that distinctive raised section at the back of the ship where officers had their quarters, had to be both lightweight enough not to make the ship unstable and strong enough to withstand Atlantic storms. The bow had to be shaped to cut through waves efficiently while providing space for anchors and rigging. Installing the mast steps, the massive pieces of timber that would hold the masts in place, was another critical operation. A typical Portuguese carrack had 3 or 4 masts, each one essentially a tree trunk that extended from near the keel up through the deck. The mast steps had to distribute the enormous forces generated by wind-filled sails across the ship's structure. Then came the detailed finish work that could take months. Installing the rudder and its complex steering mechanism, creating the intricate rigging systems with miles of rope, mounting the blocks and pulleys that would control the sails, installing windlasses and capstans for raising anchors and heavy loads, fitting gun ports and mounting cannons, building the galley where food would be prepared, creating sleeping quarters and applying protective coatings of tar and paint. The Portuguese paid special attention to the underwater portion of the hull. They would apply a mixture of tar, sulfur and animal fat to protect against shipworms, those devastating marine organisms that could bore through wooden hulls and sink ships. Some Portuguese shipwrights even experimented with copper sheathing long before it became common practice in the 18th century. Throughout this entire construction process, which could take anywhere from 6 months for a small caravel to 3 years for a massive carrack, quality control was constant. The providor and master shipwrights would inspect every joint, every plank, every fitting. A ship built for royal service or for a voyage to India had to meet exacting standards because lives and fortunes would depend on its seaworthiness. Now we come to one of the most fascinating aspects of historical shipbuilding, the actual science and engineering of getting these massive vessels from land into water. When I first started researching this, I thought, how hard could it be? Just push it into the water, right? But the more I learned, the more I realized this was one of the most dangerous and technically complex operations in all of shipbuilding. Let me start with the fundamental physics problem. A large Portuguese carrack could weigh 300 to 500 tons when empty, and some of the largest war galleons exceeded 1,000 tons. That's equivalent to the weight of hundreds of modern cars. This mass had to be moved from a stationary position on land, down a sloped ramp and into water, all while keeping the ship perfectly balanced and preventing it from rolling, breaking apart, or becoming stuck. The Portuguese, like other European shipbuilders of the era, understood principles of friction, leverage and buoyancy, even if they didn't express them in modern scientific terms. They knew that reducing friction was essential, so they developed sophisticated systems of greased slides and rollers. They understood that the ship's weight had to be evenly distributed during the launch to prevent structural stress that could crack the hull. The timing of the launch was also critical and had to account for tides. The Portuguese shipyards along the Tagus River and other tidal waters would schedule launches for high tide, when the water would reach furthest up the slipway. This reduced the distance the ship had to travel on the slipway and meant that the ship would become buoyant sooner, taking weight off the supporting structure. But here's where it gets really interesting. The transition moment when the ship goes from being fully supported by the slipway to being partially supported by water. This is called the floating off point, and it was the most dangerous moment of any launch. If the ship entered the water too quickly, it could dive bow first and flood. If it entered too slowly, it might become stuck partially in the water. If it wasn't perfectly balanced, it could roll to one side. The Portuguese shipwrights calculated the center of gravity carefully. They knew that a ship would naturally want to right itself in water if properly designed, but during the launch, before it was fully afloat, the physics were different. The ship was essentially a massive seesaw, pivoting on the point where it contacted the slipway, with one end in water and one end on land. To manage this, they would sometimes add temporary ballast, rocks or sand placed strategically in the hull to adjust the ship's balance during launch. This ballast would be removed after the ship was safely afloat. They also paid close attention to the ship's trim, making sure it was slightly bow-heavy or stern-heavy, depending on the design of the slipway and the launch method being used. The angle of entry into the water was crucial. Too steep an angle, and the ship would hit the water with tremendous force, potentially damaging the hull or causing it to submarine underwater briefly before bobbing back up. Too shallow an angle, and the ship might slide into the water so gently that it became stuck in the mud or sand of the river bottom before achieving buoyancy. Portuguese shipwrights also had to consider the strength of the hull itself during launch. When a ship is floating in water, its weight is distributed evenly across the entire hull by water pressure. This is Archimedes' principle of buoyancy. But when a ship is resting on a slipway, its weight is concentrated on just a few support points. During the launch, as the ship transitions from land support to water support, there are moments when the stress on certain parts of the hull is actually greater than it will ever experience again, even in the worst storms. To manage this stress, the Portuguese developed complex systems of supporting cradles that held the ship during construction and the early stages of launching. These cradles were carefully designed to distribute weight and were often built as integral parts of the slipway itself. As the ship began to slide, these cradles would move with it, maintaining support until the vessel was far enough into the water to float. The speed of the launch also had to be controlled. An uncontrolled launch could see the ship accelerating down the slipway, building up momentum that would make the impact with the water destructive. To prevent this, the Portuguese used several braking systems. Heavy ropes attached to the ship and to fixed anchor points on shore would play out slowly, restraining the ship's motion. Wedges and chocks could be removed or adjusted to control the speed. In some cases, controlled resistance was created by having teams of workers holding ropes, acting as human brakes. Environmental factors played a huge role, too. The Portuguese had to consider wind conditions. A strong wind could push against the high sides of a ship during launch, causing it to veer off course or roll. They had to monitor the condition of the slipway itself. Wood that was too dry wouldn't be slippery enough, while wood that was too wet might be unstable. The water conditions mattered too. Rough water could damage a ship as it entered, while calm water was ideal. Let me now describe the actual techniques the Portuguese used to launch their ships. I find this absolutely fascinating because these methods evolved over centuries and represented solutions to problems that shipbuilders faced every single day. The most common method was the sideways launch, or broadside launch, particularly for smaller to medium-sized vessels. In this technique, the ship was built with its length perpendicular to the water's edge. When launch day came, the ship would be pushed or would slide sideways into the water. This method had significant advantages. It required less distance from the construction site to the water, it was easier to control the ship's entry angle, and it worked well in locations where the shoreline didn't allow for a long, straight slipway. For sideways launches, the Portuguese developed elaborate wooden frameworks called launching ways. These were essentially railroad tracks made of wood, running from under the ship down into the water. The ship would rest on a cradle that sat on these ways, and the cradle would be heavily greased with tallow, lard, or soap. When the restraining blocks were removed, the ship and cradle would slide along these ways into the water. The challenge with sideways launches was that the ship entered the water suddenly and completely. One moment it was fully on land, the next it was fully in water, which created that dramatic splash everyone loved to watch. But this also meant that the calculations had to be absolutely perfect. The Portuguese would conduct surveys of the river or harbour bottom where the ship would enter, making sure there were no obstructions and that the water was deep enough. For larger vessels, particularly the massive carracks and galleons built for East Indies voyages or for military service, the Portuguese often used the stern first launch or bow first launch method. In this technique, the ship was built with its length aligned with the slipway, pointing either toward or away from the water. The slipway would slope gently down to the water, and the ship would slide straight down this slope. The bow first launch was particularly dramatic. The ship would begin its journey nose down, with the bow entering the water first. As more and more of the ship entered the water, buoyancy would begin to lift the bow, and the ship would gradually level out. This method allowed for more controlled entry and was preferred for very large, heavy vessels, because it distributed the stresses more evenly over time. The stern first launch was another option, particularly popular in the Portuguese shipyards, because it meant that the ornately decorated stern, often featuring elaborate carvings, the ship's name, and religious imagery, was the last thing to enter the water and was less likely to be damaged. In a stern first launch, the back of the ship would enter the water first, with the bow remaining on land longer. This actually had some advantages in terms of stability, because the heavier bow section remained supported by the slipway longer. Regardless of the launch direction, the preparation was similar. In the days leading up to launch, workers would reinforce the slipway, apply fresh grease to all sliding surfaces, position the restraining ropes, and conduct final inspections. The ship itself would be checked thoroughly. Was every plank secure? Was the caulking complete? Were there any signs of weakness in the structure that might not withstand the stress of launching? On launch day, the area around the slipway would be cleared of all unnecessary personnel. The launch master, typically the master shipwright who had overseen the construction, would take command of the operation. He would have teams stationed at various positions, men at the restraining ropes, men ready to guide the ship with poles if it started to veer off course, men in boats waiting to attach tow lines once the ship was afloat, and men standing by with emergency equipment in case something went wrong. The actual initiation of the launch began with removing the blocks and wedges that held the ship in place. This was done in a specific sequence, calculated to release the ship gradually. As each block was removed, more weight would shift onto the remaining supports and onto the launching ways themselves. The men controlling the restraining ropes would take up the tension, ready to prevent the ship from sliding too quickly. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The master would give the signal, usually with a flag or a shout, and the final blocks would be removed. The ship would begin to move. At first, it might move just inches, then feet, then it would gather momentum. The sound was incredible, the groaning of wood under stress, the creaking of ropes, the scraping of the cradle on the greased ways, the shouts of workers, and then the enormous splash as the ship met the water. The Portuguese had another technique that was used for smaller vessels and in situations where the slipway couldn't be built at an ideal angle. This was the hauling method, where the ship wasn't launched down toward the water, but was actually pulled into the water by men using capstans, windlasses, and ropes. This method gave maximum control, but required enormous human effort. Sometimes dozens of men would be needed on the capstan bars, walking in circles for hours, slowly winching the ship toward and into the water. In some Portuguese shipyards, particularly those building small fishing vessels and coastal traders, a simpler method was used. The ship would be built on a simple slipway, or even just on the beach, and when ready, teams of men would use wooden levers and rollers to physically push and roll the ship into the water. This sounds crude, but for vessels weighing just a few tons, it was effective and required minimal infrastructure. The Portuguese also developed methods for launching ships in locations where traditional slipways couldn't be built. For instance, in colonial ports where facilities were primitive. Historical records describe ships being built on temporary wooden platforms that could be dismantled, allowing the ship to settle onto rollers and be moved to the water's edge. In some cases, high tides were used creatively. A ship would be built in a location that would be flooded at extreme high tides, and the launch would be scheduled for these rare occasions when the water came to the ship rather than the ship going to the water. Now I want to take you into the human side of ship launching, because this is where the story really comes alive for me. Behind every successful launch were dozens, sometimes hundreds, of skilled and unskilled workers whose coordination and effort made the impossible possible. The organization of labor for a ship launch was militaristic in its precision. At the top was the master shipwright, who had overall authority and responsibility. This was typically someone who had spent their entire life in shipyards, starting as a young apprentice and working their way up through decades of experience. The master shipwright for a major launch would have assistants, senior carpenters and craftsmen who knew the ship intimately because they had helped build it. Below them were specialized teams. The rope handlers were absolutely critical. These men controlled the heavy hawsers, thick ropes made of hemp or manila that restrained the ship during its slide into the water. The timing and coordination of letting these ropes out had to be perfect. Let them out too fast, and the ship would accelerate dangerously. Hold them too tight, and the ropes could snap, potentially killing anyone nearby when they whiplashed back. There were also the men responsible for the slipway itself. In the hours before launch, they would be making final adjustments, adding more grease to the ways, checking for any obstacles or problems. These workers understood that their work directly affected whether the launch would succeed or fail. The general laborers provided raw muscle power. For launches that used the hauling method, or for ships that needed to be pushed or guided, these men were essential. Portuguese shipyards drew their general laborers from the local population, but also from sailors between voyages, soldiers, and even prisoners who were sometimes assigned to shipyard labor. The number of workers required depended on the size of the ship. For a small fishing vessel, a dozen men might suffice. For a medium-sized caravel, you might need 50 workers. But for a large carrack or galleon, the launch could require 200 or more people, all working in coordination. Communication during a launch was challenging. Remember, these operations took place before electronic communication, even before signal flags were standardized. The Portuguese developed their own systems of calls, whistles, and visual signals. The master shipwright or launch master would have signalmen stationed at key points who would relay orders. The timing had to be precise. Teams on opposite sides of the ship might need to act simultaneously, and the only way to coordinate was through these human signal chains. The Portuguese also recognized the need for safety measures. Men working near heavy ropes were positioned so that if a rope snapped, they wouldn't be in the direct line of recoil. Workers were kept clear of areas where the ship might shift unexpectedly. Boats were stationed in the water with men ready to rescue anyone who might fall in, because not all shipyard workers knew how to swim. Training for a launch began days or even weeks in advance. New workers would be drilled in their specific roles. Experienced workers would walk through the entire process, explaining what would happen at each stage. The Portuguese understood that a successful launch depended on every person knowing their job and executing it perfectly. There was also a social and psychological dimension to the organization of labor. A ship launch was a community event. Workers took pride in their role, and there was a strong sense of camaraderie. The success of the launch meant employment would continue with outfitting the ship, and it meant that families would have income. Conversely, a failed launch could mean injury, death, and economic hardship. The Portuguese crown and shipyard administrators understood the importance of worker morale. On launch day, workers might receive extra pay, and there would often be a celebration afterward, with food and wine provided by the ship's owner or the crown. This wasn't just generosity, it was recognition that these men had just accomplished something extraordinary. Let me tell you about the dark side of ship launching, because for all the successes, there were also spectacular failures and tragedies. I think it's important to talk about these because they show just how dangerous and unpredictable this process was. Ship launches, despite all the planning and preparation, were inherently risky operations. The physics of moving a massive wooden structure were imperfectly understood. The materials were variable in quality, and 1,000 things could go wrong. Portuguese maritime archives contain sobering records of launch disasters. One of the most common failures was the ship becoming stuck partway through the launch. Imagine the ship has begun sliding down the ways, building momentum, and then suddenly it stops, stuck on the slipway with part of it in the water and part still on land. This was a nightmare scenario. The ship was now in the worst possible position, unable to go forward or backward easily, subject to stresses it wasn't designed to handle, and vulnerable to damage from waves if the water was rough. When this happened, the recovery operation was difficult and dangerous. Workers would have to carefully jack up the ship, place additional rollers or greased ways underneath, and try again. Sometimes this meant waiting for the next high tide. Sometimes it meant disassembling parts of the slipway. In the worst cases, a stuck ship might suffer structural damage that required months of repairs before it could even be launched properly. There are historical records of ships that capsized or rolled during launch. This typically happened with sideways launches where the ship's balance was miscalculated. As the ship entered the water, instead of floating upright, it would lean to one side, and before anyone could react, it would continue rolling until it was on its side or even completely inverted in the water. I cannot imagine the horror of watching months or years of work literally turn upside down in seconds. Recovering a capsized ship was extraordinarily difficult. If it had rolled in shallow water, it might be possible to right it using leverage and additional flotation, but this required weeks of work and sophisticated rigging. Some capsized ships were simply abandoned or broken up for salvage. The financial and psychological impact of such a disaster was devastating. Rope failures were another source of danger and tragedy. The restraining ropes used during launches were under enormous tension. A rope that snapped could whip through the air with deadly force, capable of cutting a man in half or sweeping multiple workers into the water. Portuguese records include accounts of fatal accidents where workers were killed by failing equipment during launches. Structural failures of the ship itself sometimes occurred during launch. Remember, the ship was experiencing stresses during launch that were different from anything it would face later. If there was a weakness in the construction, a poorly joined timber, inadequate support beams, or undetected rot in the wood, the launch could reveal it catastrophically. Ships have broken apart during launch, with sections of the hull separating or decks collapsing. There were also environmental disasters. A sudden storm during a launch could spell disaster, with high winds pushing the partially launched ship off course or rough water damaging the hull as it entered. Shipyard managers would carefully monitor weather conditions and postpone launches if conditions weren't ideal. But weather in the age before modern forecasting was unpredictable. One particularly tragic type of accident involved workers falling into the water and drowning. During the chaos of a launch, with hundreds of people moving, ropes flying, and the ship sliding, it was possible for someone to lose their footing and fall into the water between the ship and the shore. The danger was compounded by the fact that many of these men couldn't swim. Swimming wasn't a common skill in that era, even among shipyard workers and sailors. The Portuguese learned from these disasters. After significant failures, investigations would be conducted, the master shipwright would be questioned, the condition of the slipway would be examined, and the techniques used would be reviewed. Over time, this accumulation of knowledge, both of successes and failures, refined the art of ship launching. There were also economic and political consequences to launch disasters. A ship represented an enormous investment. For a merchant, a failed launch could mean financial ruin. For the Crown, a lost warship affected military capabilities. In some cases, the master shipwright could be held financially or legally responsible for failures, which added to the pressure on these individuals to get everything right. Despite these dangers, the Portuguese kept launching ships because they had no choice. The empire depended on these vessels. Trade, exploration, military power, and national prestige all required a continuous supply of ships. So the launches continued, each one a calculated risk, each one a moment of collective breath-holding. Now let me share with you one of my favorite aspects of Portuguese ship launching, the ceremonies and spiritual rituals that accompanied these events. This is where we see the deeply religious and superstitious nature of Portuguese maritime culture. For the Portuguese of the 15th and 16th centuries, launching a ship wasn't just an engineering project. It was a spiritual undertaking. Ships were going to carry men across dangerous oceans to unknown lands. The sea was seen as a realm of mystery and danger, full of storms, monsters, and divine tests. It made perfect sense to seek divine blessing and protection. Ship launching ceremonies typically began well before launch day. In the weeks leading up to the launch, the parish priest would bless the ship while it was still on the slipway. This blessing involved the priest walking around the entire vessel, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers for the ship's safety and the safety of all who would sail in her. The ship itself would be named in a religious ceremony. Portuguese ships were almost always named after saints, biblical figures, or religious concepts. You had ships named São Gabriel, Saint Gabriel, Santa Maria, Espírito Santo, Holy Spirit, and so on. The naming ceremony involved invoking the protection of the ship's patron saint and often included placing a religious relic or icon aboard the ship. On the day of the launch, religious observances intensified. The ceremony typically began with a mass celebrated near the shipyard, attended by the ship's owner, the master shipwright, key workers, and invited dignitaries. If it was a royal ship or an important vessel, members of the royal family might attend. After Mass, there would be a procession from the church to the shipyard, sometimes with religious banners and relics carried at the front. At the launch site, the priest would conduct a final blessing. This wasn't just a quick prayer. It was an elaborate ritual. The priest would bless the 4 cardinal points around the ship, representing protection from all directions. He would bless the bow, asking for safe passages, and the stern, asking for favorable winds. He would bless the mast, the deck, and the hull below the waterline. All of this was accompanied by prayers, hymns sung by the assembled crowd, and the burning of incense. Holy water was used liberally. In some cases, bottles of holy water would actually be poured onto the slipway in front of the ship, so that the vessel would slide over blessed ground as it entered the water. The Portuguese believed this would protect the ship from sea demons and evil spirits. The actual moment of launch was timed, when possible, with religious significance. Launches might be scheduled for feast days of important saints, or for times when the church calendar indicated auspicious conditions. The Portuguese were not above consulting almanacs and even astrological charts to choose the best time for a launch. As the ship began to move, the assembled crowd would pray aloud. The most common prayer was to the Virgin Mary, who was seen as the special protector of Portuguese sailors. The Ave Maria would be recited or sung by hundreds of voices as the ship slid toward the water. The moment the ship entered the water and achieved flotation was greeted with cheers, prayers of thanksgiving, and often the ringing of church bells that could be heard across the city. The Portuguese also had a tradition of breaking a bottle of wine against the bow of the ship as it entered the water. This is the origin of the modern champagne bottle christening that we still see today at ship launches. The wine represented the blood of Christ and was meant to consecrate the vessel. If the bottle didn't break on the first try, it was considered a bad omen, and the launch might even be postponed. After a successful launch, there would be a ceremony of thanksgiving. The crowd would proceed back to the church for a Te Deum, a hymn of praise and thanksgiving. The ship's owner would often make a donation to the church or commission a special mass in gratitude for the successful launch. But the spiritual rituals didn't end with the launch. Before the ship's first voyage, there would be additional blessings. The sailors themselves would attend mass and confession. They would make vows and promises, perhaps to make a pilgrimage to a certain shrine if they returned safely, or to donate a portion of their wages to the church. The captain of the ship would receive a special blessing from the bishop or a high-ranking church official. The ship would carry religious items on every voyage. Every Portuguese ship had a shrine or altar on board, usually in the captain's cabin or in a dedicated space on the main deck. This shrine would have icons of saints, a crucifix, holy water, and sometimes relics. Daily prayers would be said at this shrine, and in times of danger, the entire crew would gather there to pray. The Portuguese also had superstitions surrounding launches. Certain things were considered bad luck and had to be avoided. It was considered unlucky to launch a ship on a Friday, particularly Friday the 13th. This superstition came from the belief that Christ was crucified on a Friday, making it an inauspicious day for new beginnings. Women were sometimes not allowed at launches based on old maritime superstitions, though this rule was not universally followed and depended on the specific shipyard and cultural practices of the region. If someone whistled during a launch, it was thought to whistle up a storm that would doom the ship. Any accident during the launch, even a minor injury to a worker, was seen as a bad omen for the ship's future. The Portuguese believed that a ship that had a troubled berth would have a troubled life at sea. There were also good luck traditions. If a bird landed on the ship during or immediately after launch, this was seen as an excellent omen, suggesting that the ship would have favorable winds and safe voyages. A rainbow appearing during a launch was considered the ultimate blessing, a sign that God himself approved of the vessel. The integration of religion into every aspect of ship launching reflected the Portuguese worldview of the era. The sea was God's domain, and human maritime endeavors were only possible with divine permission and protection. The elaborate ceremonies weren't just superstition or empty ritual. They were expressions of genuine faith and recognition of human limitations in the face of nature's power. Even the Portuguese nobility and royalty participated in these religious aspects. King Manuel, I was known to personally attend ship launches and participate in the blessings. Queen Eleanor of Austria commissioned special prayers for the safety of ships traveling to the Indies. The royal family understood that their empire depended on these ships, and they were willing to invoke all available spiritual resources to ensure their success. What fascinates me most about these ceremonies is how they brought together all levels of Portuguese society. On launch day, you would see the master shipwright standing next to a nobleman, with common laborers, priests, merchants, and royal officials all gathered for the same purpose. The ship launch was a moment when social hierarchies softened and everyone shared a common hope that this vessel would fulfill its purpose and return safely home. These traditions, born in medieval Portugal, spread throughout the maritime world. Spanish, Dutch, English, and French shipbuilders all adopted variations of the Portuguese launch ceremonies. Even today, modern ship launches retain echoes of these old traditions. The christening with a bottle, the prayers or speeches, the sense of ceremony and significance. When I see a modern ship launch, I'm always reminded that we're continuing a tradition that the Portuguese perfected 5 centuries ago. And now we've reached the final topic, and this one is all about you. Yes, you watching this video right now. We've just taken an incredible journey together through 5 centuries of maritime history. We've explored the shipyards where empires were born, witnessed the incredible craftsmanship that went into building these wooden giants, understood the physics and engineering that made launches possible, seen the techniques that evolved over generations, met the workers whose muscle and skill made it all happen, learned about the disasters that taught hard lessons, and experienced the spiritual and ceremonial side of Portuguese maritime culture. But here's the thing, history isn't just about the past. It's about connecting the past to our present and understanding how the achievements and struggles of people centuries ago still resonate today. And that's where you come in. I want to hear from you. What part of this story fascinated you most? Was it the engineering ingenuity, the human drama, the religious ceremonies? Drop a comment below and tell me what captured your imagination. I read every single comment, and I love learning what resonates with different people. Here are some questions to get you thinking. If you had been alive in 1500s Portugal, what role would you have wanted to play in a ship launch? Would you have been the master shipwright, calculating every angle and bearing the weight of responsibility? Would you have been one of the rope handlers, feeling the tension of that massive vessel pulling against your strength? Or would you have been in the crowd, praying and hoping for a successful launch? And here's another thought. What modern industries or activities remind you of these historic ship launches? Where do we still see this combination of engineering precision, human coordination, physical danger, and ceremonial significance? Maybe it's rocket launches at Cape Canaveral. Maybe it's the construction of massive buildings. Maybe it's something else entirely. Share your thoughts. I also want to know, what other aspects of Portuguese maritime history should I cover in future videos? Should we explore what happened after the launch, when these ships were outfitted and prepared for their voyages? Should we talk about the incredible navigation techniques the Portuguese developed? Should we dive into the ships themselves, the carracks, galleons and caravels that changed the world? Your feedback directly influences what content I create next. If you're a history enthusiast like me, if you're fascinated by engineering and human achievement, if you love stories about how our ancestors solved seemingly impossible problems, then you absolutely need to subscribe to this channel. Click that subscribe button right now, hit the notification bell so you never miss a video, and become part of our community of history lovers. And please, please don't just watch and leave. Engage with this content. Leave a comment, even if it's just a few words about what you learned or what you found interesting. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this deep dive into Portuguese maritime history. Share this video with someone who you think would appreciate it. Maybe a history teacher, a friend who loves boats, or a family member who appreciates good storytelling. Every comment, like, and share tells the algorithm that this content is valuable and helps this channel reach more people who are hungry for substantial, well-researched historical content. You're not just passively consuming content, you're actively supporting the creation of more videos like this. I want to build something special here, a community where we can explore history together, where we can marvel at human achievement, where we can learn from the past and find inspiration for the present. But I can't do it without you. Your engagement, your thoughts, your participation, that's what makes this channel more than just me talking into a camera. That's what makes it a conversation, a shared journey through time. So here's my challenge to you. Before you click away to your next video, leave a comment. Tell me one thing you learned today that you didn't know before. Or tell me one question you still have about Portuguese ships or maritime history. I'll do my best to answer in the comments. And your questions might even inspire future videos. Remember the Portuguese sailors who ventured into unknown waters 5 centuries ago were explorers. They faced uncertainty with courage and curiosity. In a small way, we're all explorers here on this channel, exploring the past, discovering forgotten stories, and understanding how our world came to be. Join me on this journey. Subscribe, comment, engage, and let's explore history together. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. The fact that you're still here tells me that you're genuinely interested in this content, and that means the world to me. I put enormous effort into researching and crafting these videos because I believe history matters, stories matter, and understanding where we came from helps us understand where we're going. Until next time, keep your curiosity alive, keep exploring, and keep learning. I'll see you in the next video where we'll dive into another fascinating chapter of history. Don't forget, subscribe, like, and comment. Let's make this community grow. Take care, and thanks again for being part of this journey through time. And there you have it, the complete untold story of how the Portuguese launched the ships that changed the world. From the bustling shipyards of Lisbon to the moment of truth when wood met water, from the master craftsmen who built these vessels to the workers who risked their lives to launch them, from the cutting-edge engineering to the ancient prayers, this was a process that combined human ingenuity, physical courage, technical skill, and spiritual faith. The next time you see a ship, whether it's a massive modern container vessel or a small pleasure boat, take a moment to think about the centuries of accumulated knowledge that make that ship possible. Think about the Portuguese shipwrights who helped write the first chapters of that knowledge. Think about the men who stood on slipways 500 years ago, watching their creations slide into the water, hoping and praying for success. The age of discovery didn't just happen because of brave explorers or ambitious kings. It happened because of ship launches, hundreds of ship launches, each one a minor miracle of engineering and effort. The Portuguese mastered this art, and in doing so, they gave themselves the tools to explore the world. That's the real story of Portuguese maritime dominance. Not just the voyages, but the launches that made the voyages possible. Now you know the secret. Now you've seen behind the curtain. Now you understand what it really took to launch an empire. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Now go leave that comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.